What happens when a mistress, dripping in designer clothes paid for by a cheating husband, calls the billionaire wife old and irrelevant to her face? For Chloe Vance, it meant discovering the woman she insulted didn't just own the exclusive restaurant they were in, but the entire 5-star hotel surrounding them. This isn't just a story about a quiet divorce. It's the story of Evelyn Reed, a woman who single-handedly built a global empire, and how she used its full devastating weight to remind everyone that true power is never ever irrelevant. Get ready, because the fallout is glorious. The air in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was thick with the scent of money and tuberose. It was the annual Starlight Benefit for the city's Children's Foundation, an event that served as the unofficial arena for New York's philanthropic elite to size each other up. From his position by the cascading ice sculpture of a swan, Richard Reed surveyed the room. He was a man sculpted by privilege, tall with a mane of silvering hair that he felt gave him a leonine gravitas and a smile calibrated for maximum charm. He wore a Tom Ford tuxedo that cost more than most people's cars, and on his arm was his wife Evelyn. To the casual observer, they were the perfect couple. He the charismatic public face of Reed Global Industries, and she the elegant, reserved matriarch. But the foundation of their life was not as solid as the marble floors beneath their feet. Evelyn was not the matriarch. She was the architect. Evelyn Reed was a woman of quiet, formidable presence. Tonight, she was dressed in a deep sapphire gown by Schiaparelli, a deceptively simple column of silk that hinted at the steel in her spine. A necklace of Ceylonese sapphires and diamonds, the legendary Star of the Indus, rested against her collarbones. It was a piece she had acquired herself at a Sotheby's auction, not a gift from her husband. That distinction was important. While Richard was the name, people knew Evelyn was the engine. She had started with a small inheritance and a brilliant mind for distressed assets, transforming a modest portfolio into the multi-billion-dollar behemoth that was Reed Global. She saw value where others saw ruinous skill that had served her well in business, but had she was beginning to fear, failed her in her own home. For the past year, a subtle chill had crept into her marriage, a distance that felt colder and more deliberate than the usual ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. Richard had become more secretive, his phone now a guarded fortress. There were late board meetings and sudden business trips that didn't quite align with the company's known activities. Evelyn, whose mind could untangle the most complex leveraged buyouts in minutes, had deliberately chosen not to unravel this particular thread. Not yet. To acknowledge it would be to admit a catastrophic failure in her personal judgment, a vulnerability she despised. "Darling," Richard's voice was a smooth baritone, pulling her from her thoughts. "There's Marcus Thorne from Apex Holdings. I should go and press the flesh. He's been sniffing around our European distribution deal." Evelyn gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Don't give away too much, Richard. Marcus negotiates like a shark. He smells blood in the water from a mile away." "Don't you worry your brilliant head," he said, patting her hand with a condescending affection that grated on her nerves. He strode off his back, straight a king in his court. Evelyn watched him go, her expression unreadable. She knew Marcus Thorne wasn't interested in a distribution deal. He was interested in a hostile takeover. She had already, through her own private equity firm, a separate entity from Reed Global that Richard knew little about, quietly bought up a significant minority stake in Apex Holdings. She was the shark Marcus didn't know was circling him. This was how Evelyn operated in the quiet depths away from the glittering surface. Her gaze drifted across the room past the clusters of society doyens and tech billionaires, and landed on a table near the orchestra. There, laughing with a group of junior executives from Reed Global's marketing department, was a young woman named Chloe Vance. Chloe was everything Evelyn was not. She was young, barely 26, with a cascade of blonde hair that was just a little too bright to be natural, and a laugh that was just a little too loud. She wore a crimson dress that clung to every curve, a beacon of overt sensuality in a room of studied elegance. Evelyn knew who she was. Chloe was a recent hire, a social media strategist who had, according to the internal reports Evelyn still reviewed, shown a remarkable, almost meteoric rise. Richard had mentioned her once, a dismissive wave of his hand. Bright girl, ambitious. Evelyn watched as Chloe's eyes followed Richard's path across the room. There was a proprietary gleam in that gaze, a flicker of triumph that was utterly out of place for a junior employee looking at the CEO. It was the look of a woman who believed she held a secret. The orchestra began to play a languid waltz. Couples began to drift onto the dance floor. Evelyn remained still, a statue of sapphire and diamonds amidst the swirl of motion. She felt a profound weariness settle over her. The glittering chandeliers, the champagne, the empty chatter. It all felt like a beautifully constructed stage set for a play she no longer wished to be a part of. The world saw her as Mrs. Richard Reed, the billionaire's wife. They had no idea that he was the consort, and she was the crown. His latest indiscretion, personified by the girl in the red dress, was not just a betrayal of their marriage vows. It was an insult to the very empire she had built, and Evelyn Reed did not suffer insults lightly. As if sensing her scrutiny, Chloe Vance looked up, her eyes meeting Evelyn's across the crowded ballroom. For a moment the pretense fell away. There was no deference in Chloe's expression, no respect for the woman whose name signed her paychecks. Instead, there was a flash of something bold and challenging, a smirk that said, "I see you. And I'm not afraid." Evelyn's return gaze was cool and steady. She didn't acknowledge the challenge. She didn't have to. The girl was a minor variable in a complex equation. A problem to be solved. And Evelyn always solved her problems. She took a slow sip of her champagne, the cold liquid a welcome contrast to the slow-burning anger in her gut. The music swelled. But for Evelyn, the party was over. The battle had just begun. 2 weeks later, the storm broke. It did not break in the sterile environment of a boardroom or the hushed quiet of their Upper East Side penthouse. It broke in spectacular fashion in the heart of Midtown Manhattan at Ethel, the wildly exclusive 3-Michelin-star restaurant nestled within the opulent walls of the Serafina Hotel. The Serafina was the pinnacle of New York luxury, a place where old-world grandeur met modern discretion. Its patrons were a curated list of global power players, and its restaurant was booked solid for a year in advance. A table at Ethel was a statement. Taking your mistress there was a declaration of either supreme arrogance or profound stupidity. Richard, it seemed, was guilty of both. Evelyn was there for a late lunch with Julian Croft, the silver-haired, razor-sharp head of her legal team. They were finalizing the details of a major acquisition for her private equity firm, E.V. Reed Holdings. It was a complex deal, a multi-billion-dollar leveraged buyout of an international luxury hotel chain. It was a deal she had been working on in secret for 6 months, a massive strategic move that would once again reshape her portfolio. The target company. The very hotel group that owned the Serafina. The deal had closed at 9:05 that morning. No one knew yet. The ink on the digital signatures was barely dry. The board of Serafina Group has been recalcitrant, Julian was saying, pushing a file across the crisp, white tablecloth. But your final offer was too compelling for them to refuse. As of this morning, E.V. Reed Holdings is the sole proprietor of all 47 Serafina properties worldwide. Evelyn smiled, a rare, genuine expression that softened the stern lines of her face. They valued their pride more than their shareholders. A fatal flaw. Thank you, Julian. You've been magnificent. It is my pleasure, Evelyn. You build the empires. I just help with the paperwork. It was at that moment, as Julian gathered his papers, that Richard walked in. He didn't see Evelyn tucked away in a discreet alcove. He was too focused on his companion, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. It was Chloe Vance, looking triumphant. She was wearing a new Chanel suit, a shade of pink so vibrant it seemed to suck the air out of the tastefully muted dining room. On her wrist was a Cartier love bracelet, a piece Evelyn recognized with a sickening jolt. It was from a collection she herself had considered, before dismissing it as too common. They were seated at a prime table in the center of the room. Richard, ever the performer, was playing the part of the sophisticated benefactor, pointing out the features of the room, ordering the most expensive champagne, his voice a low, intimate murmur. Chloe drank it all in her eyes, wide with avarice. She was basking in the glow of public affirmation of being seen in this place with this man. Evelyn felt a strange, icy calm descend upon her. The initial shock was replaced by a cold, clarifying anger. All her self-imposed denial, her willful ignorance, evaporated in the face of such a flagrant public humiliation. Julian, noticing the shift in her demeanor, followed her gaze. His eyes widened slightly, and his mouth set in a thin, hard line. "Evelyn," he began, his voice low. "Let's leave. We don't have to dignify this." "No," Evelyn said, her voice quiet but firm. "Stay. I believe you'll want to witness this." For 20 minutes, Evelyn watched them. She watched Richard lean in and whisper in Chloe's ear. Watched the younger woman giggle and touch his arm. She watched him feed her a piece of his appetizer, a gesture of intimacy that was so grotesquely out of place it turned Evelyn's stomach. This wasn't just an affair. This was a performance, and it was being staged on her turf, funded by her money. Finally, she decided she had seen enough. She needed to use the powder room. Her path, deliberately chosen, would take her directly past their table. As she rose, the sapphire on her finger, a twin to her necklace, caught the light. She walked with the unhurried grace of a woman who owned every room she entered. As she approached, Richard looked up. The color drained from his face. He looked like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar, his expression a comical mixture of horror and panic. "Evelyn," he stammered, half rising from his chair. What a surprise." Chloe's head whipped around. Her initial look was one of fear, but it was quickly replaced by something harder. Spurred on by the champagne and her own inflated sense of importance, she saw this not as a disaster, but as an opportunity. A final showdown. "Evelyn," Chloe said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. She didn't stand. "Fancy seeing you here. I didn't think this was your kind of place. It's so vibrant, so current." Evelyn's gaze fell upon the younger woman, her eyes as cold and clear as diamonds. She didn't acknowledge Richard, who was now standing awkwardly, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "I was not aware," Evelyn said, her voice level, "that Reed Global's junior marketing staff enjoyed such a generous expense account." Chloe bristled, her cheeks flushing. The implication was clear. "Richard is just showing me how the other half lives," she retorted, placing a possessive hand on Richard's forearm. He thinks my perspective is valuable. Refreshing. I'm sure he does. Evelyn replied, her gaze unwavering. This was it. The moment Chloe had fantasized about. The moment she would finally put the old wife in her place. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, cutting whisper that was loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. You should know he's tired of the past. He wants a future. Someone exciting. Someone relevant. She looked Evelyn up and down, a dismissive sneer on her lips. He says it's exhausting being with someone so stern, so serious. She paused for effect, delivering the final fatal blow. Someone so old and irrelevant. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby tables. The diners who had been pretending not to listen were now fully captivated. Julian Croft looked ready to commit murder. Richard looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. He tried to speak, to intervene, but no words came out. Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. The icy calm remained. She simply held Chloe's gaze for a long, silent moment, letting the vulgarity of the words hang in the air. Then she smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator that knows the trap has been sprung. Irrelevant, Evelyn repeated softly, as if tasting the word. That's a fascinating perspective. She turned her head slightly, her eyes scanning the room until she located the restaurant's general manager, a tall, impeccably dressed man named Mr. Dubois, who was hovering nervously near the service station. She raised a single, elegant finger. Mr. Dubois was at her side in an instant, his face a mask of professional concern. Mrs. Reed, he said, bowing his head slightly. Is everything to your satisfaction? Not quite, Jean-Pierre. Evelyn said, her voice calm and authoritative. She glanced at the stunned faces of Richard and Chloe. There seems to be a misunderstanding about the clientele you allow in your establishment. She then looked back at Mr. Dubois, her eyes sharp. But that's a minor issue. Please get me Mr. Harrison on the phone, the CEO of the Serafina Group. I believe he's in his office in this very building. Tell him Evelyn Reed requires a word. Now. The manager paled. Calling the global CEO of the entire hotel group for a guest was unheard of. It was a breach of every protocol. Ma'am, I'm not sure that's possible on such short notice. Evelyn's smile didn't waver. Oh, I think you'll find it is, she said softly. Tell him his new boss is calling. The silence that fell over the table, and indeed the entire section of the restaurant, was absolute. It was a dense, heavy silence, broken only by the distant clink of cutlery from a far-off table. Chloe Vance's smug, triumphant expression froze, then slowly began to crumble, replaced by a wave of confusion. Richard stared at Evelyn, his mouth agape, a flicker of sheer, unadulterated terror dawning in his eyes. He knew that tone in her voice. It was the tone she used just before she closed a hostile deal, the one that signaled the complete and utter annihilation of an opponent. Mr. Dubois, the general manager, was paralyzed. My apologies, Mrs. Reed. Did you say, new boss? That is what I said. Evelyn confirmed, her voice never rising above a conversational level. E.V. Reed Holdings, my private investment firm, finalized the acquisition of the Serafina Hotel Group this morning at 9:05 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. As the sole shareholder that makes me, for all intents and purposes, the owner of this chair, this table, this restaurant, and the entire building we are currently sitting in. So yes, Jean-Pierre, please get Mr. Harrison on the phone. Or, On second thought. She paused, tapping a thoughtful finger on her lip. Don't bother him. He's likely having a very bad day already. You will suffice. The revelation detonated in the quiet, rarefied air of Ethel. It was a plot twist, so audacious, so devastatingly powerful that no one knew how to react. A woman at the next table literally dropped her fork. Julian Croft, her lawyer, leaned back in his chair, a look of profound, unrestrained admiration on his face. He had known about the deal, of course, but he hadn't known it would be deployed as a weapon in such a personal and public execution. Chloe Vance's face had gone from flushed pink to a pasty, sickly white. The Chanel suit suddenly looked cheap, the Cartier bracelet like a shackle. You're lying, she stammered, her voice a pathetic squeak. You're just saying that. Evelyn didn't even deign to look at her. Her entire focus was on the petrified general manager. Jean-Pierre, she said, her tone crisp and businesslike. I have 2 directives for you. First, you will bring me the check for my table, and for this table. She gestured dismissively toward Richard and Chloe. It will be comped, of course. A small perk of ownership. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Second, you will have your security staff escort this woman. She finally flicked her gaze to Chloe, a look of utter disdain in her eyes. Out of my hotel. She is no longer welcome at any Serafina property worldwide. Add her name, Chloe Vance, to a global blacklist. If she attempts to enter any of our establishments again, she is to be considered a trespasser. Chloe let out a strangled gasp. You can't do that. Oh, my dear girl, Evelyn said, a chilling pity in her voice. You have no idea what I can do. You called me irrelevant. But relevance is power. You came into my world, sat in my hotel, and insulted me. You seem to have mistaken my silence for weakness. A common and often fatal miscalculation. Richard finally found his voice, a desperate, strangled plea. Evelyn, for God's sake, stop. This is insane. We can talk about this at home. This is a private matter. You made it a public matter when you brought your protégé, she loaded the word with venom, to one of the most public restaurants in New York City. You wanted a performance, Richard. You're getting one. She turned back to Mr. Dubois, who now looked as if he would gladly trade places with a man facing a firing squad. Is there a problem, Jean-Pierre? My instructions were clear. The manager snapped into action, fear overriding his paralysis. No, Madam Reed. Not at all. Right away. He spoke urgently into his sleeve microphone, and within 30 seconds, 2 discreet but very large men in sharp suits materialized by the restaurant's entrance. They did not rush, but moved with a calm, deliberate purpose that was far more intimidating than any overt aggression. Chloe was now shaking tears of humiliation and rage welling in her eyes. Richard, do something, she pleaded, grabbing his arm. But Richard was broken. He was looking at Evelyn as if for the first time. The quiet, predictable, and he had foolishly thought passionless woman he had taken for granted for so long had vanished. In her place was a titan, a corporate warlord who had just carpet-bombed his pathetic little rebellion with the financial equivalent of a nuclear weapon. He saw his future crumbling before his eyes, the access, the prestige, the easy money. It was all tied to her, and he had just publicly, catastrophically betrayed her. Evelyn, please, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Evelyn ignored him. She looked at Chloe, who was now sobbing openly, the vibrant pink of her suit clashing horribly with her splotchy, tear-stained face. A word of advice, Evelyn said, her voice dropping so that only their table could hear. When you attempt to dethrone a queen, you had better be certain you kill her, because if you miss, she will not hesitate to burn your entire world to the ground." The security guards arrived at the table. They were polite but firm. "Ma'am," one said to Chloe, "if you'll come with us." Chloe looked from the guards to Richard, who refused to meet her eyes, and then back to Evelyn's cold, implacable face. The fight was gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. She had gambled everything on a man who was nothing without his wife, and she had just lost in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. She stood up, her body trembling, and allowed herself to be led away, the whispers and stares of the entire restaurant following her like a funeral procession. Once Chloe was gone, Evelyn finally turned her full attention to her husband. He stood a pathetic, diminished figure amidst the wreckage of his own making. "Sit down, Richard," she said. It was not a request. He sank back into his chair, his expensive suit now looking like a costume on a deflated mannequin. Evelyn remained standing, looking down at him. "We will be having a conversation later, not at home, at my lawyer's office. You will be hearing from Julian. Do not go back to the penthouse. Your access has been revoked. Your belongings will be sent to whichever hovel you choose to crawl into." "Evelyn, you can't just throw me out." "I can," she said simply. "And I have. You, like your mistress, have overestimated your relevance. You are the public face of a company you don't control, living a life you didn't build. You are a brand ambassador, Richard, and I, as the owner of that brand, have decided you are fired." She turned without another word and walked back to her table. Julian stood as she approached, his expression one of awe. "The check is taken care of, Madame Reed," said Mr. Dubois, who had reappeared at her elbow. His voice now filled with a reverence usually reserved for royalty. "And the matter has been handled." "Thank you, Jean-Pierre," Evelyn said, gathering her purse. "See that it is. I expect a full report on the implementation of the new global directive by 5 o'clock. She walked out of the restaurant, leaving her husband sitting alone in the middle of the room, a pariah in what was just moments before his kingdom. The silence was finally broken by the sound of a diner at a nearby table starting to applaud. The walk from the restaurant through the grand marble-floored lobby of the Serafina was a victory lap. The hotel staff, already alerted through a frantic, lightning-fast chain of command, seemed to instinctively know. The doorman stood straighter. The concierge's smile was more deferential. The bellhops seemed to snap to an invisible line of attention as she passed. The news of the ownership change and the dramatic events in Ethel had spread through the building like wildfire. Evelyn Reed was no longer just a VIP guest. She was the source of all power, the sun around which their entire professional world now orbited. She stepped out onto the bustling sidewalk of Fifth Avenue, the city's chaotic energy feeling less like noise and more like applause. Julian held the door of her waiting Bentley Mulsanne open. It was a deep, almost black shade of green, a car of understated immense power, much like its owner. "That," Julian said once they were settled in the silent leather and walnut interior, and the car was gliding smoothly into traffic, "was the most ruthlessly elegant maneuver I have ever witnessed in or out of a courtroom." Evelyn stared out the window, her expression unreadable. The icy composure she had maintained throughout the confrontation was beginning to thaw, revealing the raw, wounded fury beneath. "He humiliated me, Julian. He stood there and let that vacuous child call me irrelevant." She turned to face him, her eyes blazing. "Irrelevant! Me! The woman who personally negotiated the financing that saved his father's company from bankruptcy 20 years ago. the seed from which Reed Global grew. The woman whose name is on the patents that generate 60% of our tech division's revenue. He's a fool, Evelyn. A weak, arrogant fool. He is more than a fool. She countered, her voice dangerously low. He is a liability. For years I have tolerated his appetites, his need for public adoration, his affairs which I always knew about, despite his pathetic attempts at discretion. I tolerated it because he was a useful figurehead, charming, plausible. He kept the board happy and the press distracted while I did the real work. But this was different. This was a direct challenge to my authority. And it was done with my money. So what is the next move? Julian asked, already knowing the answer. Evelyn didn't do things by halves. The next move, Evelyn said, her focus sharpening, is to cut out the cancer. All of it. She pulled out her phone, a custom-built, hyper-encrypted device. Her fingers moved with practiced speed. I want you to draw up the divorce papers. I want the most brutal, ironclad, airtight petition you can possibly draft. I want our post-nuptial agreement, the one he foolishly signed without reading a decade ago, enforced to the letter. Clause 12, Section B. The Infidelity and Public Disgrace Clause. Julian nodded grimly. It's a killer. It will strip him of all shares and options granted during the marriage and claw back any bonuses from the last 5 years if malfeasance is proven. His affair with an employee whose lifestyle he funded with an Amex Black Card issued by Reed Global should constitute malfeasance, wouldn't you agree? Without question, Julian confirmed. Good, Evelyn said. Next, call an emergency meeting of the Reed Global Board for tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. sharp. Cite urgent matters of executive conduct and corporate governance. She looked out the window again, a plan solidifying in her brilliant mind. Richard has made himself a reputational risk. The board values stability above all else. They will not stand by a CEO who has brought this kind of scandal to the company's doorstep, especially when the majority shareholder, that is me, is calling for his head. The car was silent for a moment as Julian absorbed the sheer velocity and ruthlessness of her plan. She was dismantling a 30-year marriage and a multi-billion-dollar corporate structure in a matter of hours. Meanwhile, back at the Serafina, Richard was experiencing the swift and brutal mechanics of a power shift. After sitting in stunned silence for 10 minutes, he finally stumbled out of the restaurant. The whispers followed him. When he tried to use the house phone to call his driver, the operator politely informed him that all house services were currently under review for him. He pulled out his cell phone to call his office and instruct his assistant to cancel his afternoon. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reed." His assistant, a woman who had worked for him for 15 years, said, her voice strained and formal. "I can't do that. I've just received an email from the office of the primary shareholder. I'm to report to Ms. Reed's executive floor from now on. All your meetings have been indefinitely postponed. I was instructed to tell you that." His blood ran cold. She had already seized his office, his staff. He walked towards the lobby, intending to go upstairs to the suite he kept for impromptu city stopovers. As he approached the elevator bank, one of the security guards who had escorted Chloe out stepped politely into his path. "Mr. Reed, I'm afraid your key card for the residential suites has been deactivated." "On whose authority?" Richard bellowed, his voice cracking. "On the authority of the owner, sir," the guard replied, his face impassive. Defeated, Richard stumbled out onto the street, the jeers of the city now feeling personal. He tried his corporate credit card to hail an Uber Black. Card declined. He tried his personal one. Declined. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He didn't understand the extent of it yet, but Evelyn's financial architecture was so deeply intertwined with their lives that she could, with a few keystrokes, turn off the flow of money like a tap. He who had never once in his adult life had to worry about cash was stranded on Fifth Avenue with no way to get home. A home he was no longer allowed to enter. He began to walk his expensive Italian shoes, pinching his feet. Humiliation burned in his chest. He thought of Chloe. He tried to call her, but the call went straight to voicemail. Her phone was likely off as she dealt with her own cascading disaster. He had promised her the world, and in the space of a single lunch, he had delivered her nothing but ruin and a global ban from a luxury hotel chain. His panic began to give way to a desperate, clawing anger. How dare she? After all he'd done for the company, the speeches, the networking, the face of the brand. He had built that, hadn't he? He had made Reed Global a household name while she hid away with her spreadsheets and lawyers. He had convinced himself that his charm was the company's greatest asset. He now faced the terrifying reality that his charm was merely a decoration, and he had just been unceremoniously stripped from the tree. The foundation, the roots, the very soil the tree grew in, that was all Evelyn. And he was about to be pruned. The next morning at precisely 8:00 a.m., the boardroom on the 72nd floor of the Reed Global Tower was filled with a palpable tension. The long obsidian table reflected the strained faces of the 7 board members. They were the titans of industry finance and law, men and women who controlled vast fortunes and weren't easily rattled. Today, they were rattled. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, a position usually occupied by Richard. She was dressed in a charcoal grey power suit, her demeanour calm, her focus absolute. Opposite her at the far end of the table was an empty chair. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Evelyn began, her voice resonating with quiet authority in the soundproofed room. "As you know, I called this emergency meeting to discuss a matter of grave importance to the stability and reputation of this company." Just then the doors to the boardroom burst open and Richard strode in, his face pale but defiant. He had spent a sleepless night at a boutique hotel paid for with the last few $100s of cash he had in his wallet, his mind racing through scenarios of apologies and justifications. He had decided on a strategy of righteous indignation. "What is the meaning of this, Evelyn?" he boomed, attempting to project an authority he no longer possessed, calling a board meeting behind my back. "This is my company." "No, Richard," Evelyn stated calmly without looking at him. "It is my company. You are merely its CEO, a position that is, as of this morning, under review." She gestured to the empty chair. "Please sit. The proceedings concern you." Richard hesitated, then sank into the chair, his attempted power play fizzling out into awkward silence. The other board members, General Peterson, a retired 4-star general, Eleanor Vance, no relation to Chloe, the formidable head of a major bank, and the others avoided his gaze. They had all seen the rumors swirling on social media and the gossip columns. Page 6 already had a headline, "Billionaire Brawl at Ethel Reed Empire Rocks." Yesterday. Evelyn continued, her gaze sweeping across the board members. "Mr. Reed engaged in conduct that represents a catastrophic lapse in judgment and a direct violation of his fiduciary duties to this corporation." On the large screen behind her, an image appeared. It was a crystal-clear security, still from the restaurant. It showed Chloe Vance, hand on Richard's arm, leaning in to deliver her old and irrelevant line. The expressions on their faces, on Evelyn's, on the shocked patrons. It was all there. A collective intake of breath went through the room. "This is a private matter," Richard protested, his voice strained. "It has no bearing on my ability to run this company." "On the contrary," Evelyn said, advancing to the next slide. It was a detailed breakdown of Chloe Vance's employment file, her hiring date, her suspiciously rapid promotions, her salary which was double that of her peers with more experience. "Miss Chloe Vance was hired 18 months ago," Evelyn explained. "In that time, her salary has been increased 4 times, all on the direct personal authorization of the CEO. She has been granted stock options not typically available to an employee at her level. All, I might add, without any commensurate performance metrics to justify such a rise." The next slide was the nail in the coffin. It was a detailed expense report from the corporate American Express card Richard had given Chloe. Tens of thousands of dollars spent at Chanel, Gucci, and Cartier, spa weekends, first-class flights to marketing conferences in St. Bart's that had never actually occurred. "Mr. Reed has been embezzling corporate funds to finance his affair with a subordinate employee," Evelyn stated, the words landing like hammer blows. "This is not a private matter. This is fraud. It exposes Reed Global to shareholder lawsuits, to say nothing of the reputational damage caused by his public spectacle." General Peterson, a man whose face looked like it was carved from granite, spoke for the first time, his voice a low rumble. "Richard, is this true?" Richard looked around the table, seeking an ally, and found none. Their faces were masks of cold, professional fury. They were not his friends. They were guardians of the company, and he had endangered it. It's a misunderstanding. The expenses were discretionary," Eleanor Vance scoffed. "Discretionary? Richard, you bought a 26-year-old social media strategist a $50,000 watch with shareholder money. The only thing discretionary here was your sense of self-preservation." Evelyn let their condemnation sink in before delivering the coup de grace. "As the majority shareholder of this company, and pursuant to Clause 12, Section B of my post-nuptial agreement, which governs my personal assets, including my controlling stake in Reed Global, I have lost all faith in Mr. Reed's ability to lead. The morality clause has been triggered by his actions. Therefore, I am tabling a motion for the immediate termination of Richard Reed as CEO and his removal from this board for cause." She looked directly at her husband, down the length of the table. The man she had once loved, the man she had built a world for, looked shrunken, pathetic, his blustering anger replaced by the dawning horrific understanding of his complete and utter ruin. "All those in favor?" Evelyn asked. One by one, every hand around the table went up. General Peterson, Eleanor Vance, the rest of the board. It was unanimous. "The motion carries," Evelyn announced into the deafening silence. "Richard, your employment with Reed Global is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Do not attempt to enter any of our offices again." Richard stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and hatred. "You'll regret this, Evelyn." "No, Richard," she replied, her voice devoid of all emotion. "My only regret is that I didn't do this sooner. You were a bad investment, and I always divest myself of bad investments." 2 security guards, the same ones from the hotel, entered the room. They stood on either side of Richard's chair. He looked at the faces of the board members, the people he had golfed with, dined with, laughed with. He saw nothing but cold, hard calculation. He had become a threat to the bottom line. He had become irrelevant. He stood, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and allowed himself to be led out of the boardroom and out of the life he had known forever. Evelyn watched him go, then turned back to the board. "Now," she said, her voice all business, "let's discuss the transition plan. I will be assuming the role of interim CEO." The fallout was swift and merciless. For Richard, leaving the Reed Global Tower was like being ejected from a pressurized cabin into the thin, cold air of irrelevance. The first 24 hours were a blur of escalating humiliations. His corporate apartment key no longer worked. His driver no longer answered his calls. When he tried to call his personal banker at JP Morgan Private Bank, a man he'd known for years, he was politely informed by a junior associate that his accounts were under review pending legal instruction and had been frozen. Evelyn hadn't just fired him. She had financially excommunicated him. He was forced to check into a mid-range Hilton near Times Square, paying with his debit card, watching his dwindling personal funds with a sense of panic he'd never known. The news of his ousting was everywhere: the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, the Financial Times. They used words like disgraced, scandal, and ignominious exit. His friends, the sycophants and hangers-on who had populated his life, suddenly became unreachable. Calls went to voicemail, texts were left unread. He was a social leper. Desperate and alone, he finally got a call through to Chloe. She was a wreck. Her tearful, hysterical voice was a torrent of accusations and fear. "They fired me," she shrieked over the phone from her trendy Soho apartment, an apartment he now realized he could no longer pay for. They sent a courier with a termination letter, citing gross misconduct. My keycard to the office was deactivated midday. My corporate cards are declined, Richard. What is happening? She's cutting us off, Chloe, he said, his voice hollow. She's cutting us completely off. What about your money? Chloe demanded, her voice shifting from panic to the sharp edge of transactional concern that had always underpinned their relationship. Your personal fortune. You told me you were worth hundreds of millions. It was connected, he stammered, the full, horrifying truth crashing down on him. It was all tied up in Reed Global stock and trusts that she controlled. I was the king, but she owned the kingdom. The crown, the throne, the whole damn castle. Chloe's end of the line went silent for a moment, the sound of her frantic, shallow breathing the only noise. The fantasy she had built of becoming the next Mrs. Reed, of a life of effortless luxury and status, had evaporated. She hadn't been romancing a king. She'd been the plaything of a prince consort who had just been banished from the court. Her world began to unravel with the same brutal speed as Richard's. The story of her public humiliation at Ethel, complete with the old and irrelevant quote, was now society gossip gold. She was a punchline. When she tried to leverage her experience at Reed Global to get a new job, doors were politely but firmly shut in her face. Evelyn's influence was vast and unseen. A quiet word to the right headhunter, a subtle hint to a rival CEO, and Chloe Vance was blacklisted. She was radioactive. Within a week, she received an eviction notice for her apartment. The lease was in the name of a shell corporation controlled by Reed Global. Without Richard to foot the bill, she was out. The Chanel suits and Cartier bracelets suddenly felt like costumes for a life she could no longer pretend to lead. She was forced to sell them for a fraction of their value to consignment shops in the West Village. The shame of it, a burning coal in her stomach. She had flown too close to the sun, and now she was crashing back to earth with nothing but the scorched feathers of her ambition. She had to break her lease pack, her own boxes, and retreat to her parents' modest home in suburban New Jersey, the very life she had been so desperate to escape. Richard's descent was even more profound. He hired a lawyer, a second-rate shark, who promised to fight the post-nuptial agreement. It was a futile effort. Julian Croft, representing Evelyn, systematically dismantled their case in a preliminary hearing. The evidence was overwhelming the contract ironclad. Richard was left with nothing but a mountain of legal fees he couldn't pay. He was forced to sell his prized possessions that weren't tied to Evelyn, a vintage Porsche, a watch collection. It was a pittance, a drop in the ocean of the lifestyle he had lost. He moved into a small rented condo in Fort Lee, New Jersey, looking across the Hudson River at the glittering Manhattan skyline that had once been his domain. It was a daily, torturous reminder of everything he had thrown away. The leonine charisma was gone, replaced by the haunted, desperate look of a man who had lost his identity. He wasn't Richard Reed, the titan of industry, anymore. He was just Richard, a man in late middle age, with no job, no prospects, and a future as bleak as a winter sky. He had traded an empire for a fleeting affair with an ambitious girl, and in the end, he had lost them both and himself along with them. While Richard and Chloe were spiraling into their respective abysses, Evelyn was thriving. Taking the helm of Reed Global as CEO wasn't a challenge, it was a homecoming. She had always been the de facto leader, the strategic mind behind the curtain. Now she simply stepped into the spotlight she had long eschewed. Her first week was a masterclass in corporate leadership. She calmed the rattled nerves of the shareholders with a confident and clear vision for the future. She held a company-wide town hall, not from the executive floor, but in the main atrium, speaking to her employees with a transparency and respect they had never received from Richard. She didn't mention the scandal, but she didn't have to. Her presence alone was a message the era of flash and ego was over. The era of substance and strategy had begun. Productivity soared. Morale, after the initial shock, skyrocketed. The employees, particularly the women who had long been overlooked by Richard's boys' club mentality, felt empowered. They saw in Evelyn a leader who valued intelligence and competence above all else. The acquisition of the Serafina Hotel Group was seamlessly integrated into E.V. Reed Holdings. Evelyn spent her days in back-to-back meetings, her nights poring over architectural plans for new properties and revenue projections. She was energized, alive in her element. The pain of Richard's betrayal had been a catalyst, a fire that had burned away the dead wood of her life and cleared the path for new growth. She realized she had not just been tolerating his affairs. She had been tolerating his mediocrity, allowing his shadow to obscure her own brilliance for the sake of a quiet life she didn't even want. 3 months after the incident at Ethel, Evelyn sat in Julian Croft's office. The divorce was final. Richard, humbled and defeated, had signed everything accepting a meager court-mandated settlement that would allow him to live comfortably, but not luxuriously. He was permanently out of her life and her company. "It's done," Julian said, sliding a final document across the polished mahogany desk. "Thank you, Julian," Evelyn said, signing her name with a firm, steady hand. There was no sadness in her, only a sense of release. Later that day, she chaired her first official shareholder meeting as the permanent CEO of Reed Global. The grand ballroom where the Starlight benefit had been held was now the setting for her coronation. She stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, investors, analysts, journalists. For too long, she began, her voice clear and strong. Reed Global has been defined by its personality. Today, we redefine it by its purpose. We will be pioneers in sustainable technology. We will expand our philanthropic footprint. We will invest in the brilliant minds within this company, not just its public face. The age of the brand ambassador is over. The age of the architect has begun. She then announced a new multi-billion-dollar initiative to fund female-led startups in the tech sector, a bold, visionary move that instantly dominated the financial news cycle. The company's stock, which had dipped briefly during the scandal, surged to an all-time high. That evening, she didn't go home to the silent, empty penthouse. She went to the Serafina. She didn't go to Ethel, the scene of her painful public triumph. Instead, she went to the hotel's private rooftop lounge, a glass-encased jewel box with a panoramic view of the city she now so completely dominated. Mr. Dubois, now the newly promoted regional director for North American operations, personally escorted her to the best table. "Madam Reed," he said with genuine reverence. "Welcome." "Thank you, Jean-Pierre," she said, gazing out at the endless constellation of lights that was New York City. "It's good to be home." She sat there alone, sipping a glass of vintage champagne, not as a scorned wife seeking revenge, but as an empress surveying her empire. She had been called old and irrelevant, but she had proven that true power isn't about youth or noise or public attention. It's about substance, strategy, and the unshakable will to build something that lasts. Evelyn Reed hadn't just bought a hotel. She had bought back her life, and her reign was just beginning. Evelyn Reed didn't just win. She rewrote the rules of the game. Her story is a powerful reminder that substance will always triumph over spectacle, and that the quietest person in the room is often the most powerful. She refused to be a victim, transforming her personal pain into professional power, and turning a moment of profound humiliation into a hostile takeover that secured her legacy. She proved that being called irrelevant is not an insult when you own the entire building. What did you think of Evelyn's ultimate power move? Was it brilliant revenge or a masterclass in business strategy? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love stories of epic empowerment and seeing arrogance get its due, make sure you hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas. Don't miss what we have coming up next.